Welcome to Titubanti Testi 12, Binomio di lettura. It is my pleasure to introduce our binomio today with Giacomo Loi and Virginia Burrus. Thank you so much for accepting this invitation. We have a very particular text. It is not a text written in Latin or in Greek. But it's written in Hebrew. Is that correct? Yeah. So we obviously received the English translation. We don't know the name of the translator, Giacomo. I guess it's not you.
No, it's not me.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, you will say possibly something about the translator. And this text, this binomio today, belongs to the series of the modern or contemporary texts, which are somehow related to classical antiquity. And of course, this is a marvelous text which gives us the possibility about thinking of classical culture from a perspective which actually should be quite familiar to us, and yet it's not. So I'm very glad that we are going to have this conversation today with two very diverse speakers. And that having said, I give immediately the word to Virginia Burrus, who is reaching us from, I don't know where you are in.
I'm in Vermont right now.
Yeah. In Vermont, right? Yeah, in Vermont, not in Syracuse. Yeah, of course. Virginia, thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Marco, so much for the invitation. And also thanks to Giacomo for bringing this poem before us. It's certainly new to me. Marco said I should say a word about myself, just so you have a sense of where I'm coming. I'm not in the field of classics per se, as I take it most of you are. I'm trained in kind of at the borders of religious studies and the study of late antiquity. And I work primarily, not exclusively, on Christianity, the sort of literary and religious culture of Christianity in late antiquity. So that's it's kind of my point of entry. I've worked a lot on gender and sexuality and body and materiality. And for the last 15 years or so, a lot on eco-critical approaches to antiquity. So which might or might not be in play here. So I'm going to start. My remarks are going to be short, just about 10 minutes total, and in two parts. And for the first part, I need some images, so I'm going to try to share. Let's see. And I don't know how I can tell if I've succeeded in sharing. Do you all see a PowerPoint?
You did, yes. It's
yes.
Yeah,
okay.
We do.
Okay, great. For some reason, that is not absolutely clear to me, but okay. So I want to approach this poem indirectly by first considering another statue, not of Apollo, but of Dionysus. This small-scale Roman bronze, which stands about a foot high, was crafted in the 2nd or 3rd century of the Common Era. The god subsequently lost his crown and cloak, as well as his arms. But in the 8th or 9th century, his by then fully nude body gained new ornamentation. Okay, now. So does wait, I think I see it.
Oh, yes, right.
There we go. All right. Yeah. Dionysus's chest and thighs were stamped with cross-shaped monograms, his hips girded with a line of writing. The two monograms on the chest together spell out the traditional prayer, "Lord, help me," while the monograms on the thighs spell out the name of the supplicant, Bartholomew, son of Timothy. The provocatively placed belt cites the opening words of Psalm 28, verse 3 in the Septuagint. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. Most Byzantine viewers would know that the rest of the verse continues, "The God of glory thunders, the Lord is over the great waters." This same verse is cited in the liturgy for the blessing of the waters on the Feast of Epiphany, which celebrates Christ's baptism. The version composed by Cosmos the Melodist in the 8th century, so roughly contemporaneous with the inscriptions, reads as follows. I have heard your voice, Lord, crying in the wilderness, when you thundered over the mighty waters, bearing witness to your Son. While it is unlikely that it was used liturgically, scholars have hypothesized that the hollow statue was repurposed domestically as a holder of holy water. So we have here the statue of a god overwritten, tattooed with the words of a new prayer, a new book, a new ritual. Here's a question. In the process, is Dionysus forgotten? Does Bartholomew, son of Timothy, even know who he is? Is the god alternatively remembered only so as to be delegated to ancient times and other days, relic of a lost, perhaps very nearly irrelevant past? Or, and this is how it seems to me, is he not rather actively invoked, effectively summoned into presence, while remaining at the same time bound within the terms of his reinscription in a new Christian magic? Chest, thighs, hips, the sensuousness of the god is only enhanced by his body's acquired decorations. Yet that sensuousness is also, we may imagine, disciplined, controlled, restrained, belted and branded. Will the god's vegetal power, his life force, ultimately burst the chains that bound it? The answer to that question is held indefinitely in suspense in our little statue. Here's another question. Who voices these words, Lord, help me? Does the statue speak? Alternatively, does it offer a script to the one who stands before it? Or is the figure of the god simply understood to be the recipient of the words? Perhaps all of these are in play. The inscribed statue is the medium that enables prayer, allowing God and supplicant to meet in the voicing of prayer, praise and petition. An encounter shaped by oppositions, attractions, and reversals. We may take note of the audacity, the imperiousness of the helpless supplicant, of the neediness of the thundering God, waiting to be called. And finally, the uncanny power of the silent statue, so easily overlooked. Who binds and who is bound? Okay. Stop sharing now. Did that succeed?
Yes.
The little bronze statue helps me think about a poem that I initially found both a bit intimidating. What do I know about modern Hebrew poetry? And a bit off-putting in its vitalist Nietzschean tenor. Vitalist Nietzschean being a phrase I borrow from Ito Harari, who introduced Tschernikowsky's poem for a collection published in 2024. It's a difficult moment just now for confronting celebrations of a masculine life force, not to mention references to the biblical account of Israel's divinely aided conquest of Canaan. Lord, help me. And perhaps the little God answers that prayer, at least partially, pointing me to some questions I might ask of the poem, if not giving me answers. So I've got 3 of these, and then I'm done. First question, or set of questions. What can we say about the body of the statue in our poem, about its materiality? Is it not largely a spatial and relational body? The statue is a statue of Apollo, however we might imagine it, and it is in front of us. We are placed before it. It is the thing that the poem has us face and address. I come to you, forgotten God of the ages. The statue is also old then. Like the God it evokes, it has outlasted many generations of humans, enduring long enough to have been lost and forgotten, long enough to be found and remembered again. Paradoxically, it still has the shimmer of the fresh youth God, contrasting with the gods of a later age who have now themselves grown old. However, when the statue itself is finally named as such in the last stanza, I come to you before your statue kneeling, something seems to shift. It is no longer a god or even an image of a god in the same immediate sense, but a symbol or stand-in for a series of Platonic abstractions. Life's brightness, the good and the sublime, life, valor, beauty. Time, whether the time of a human, a statue, or an ancient god, seems to give way to eternity in these lines. Marble or bronze, if that's how we imagine it, is subsumed by transcendence. Is this a transcendence of the material or a transcendence taking place within the material? Our narrator bows down to all things splendid throughout creation and elevated among secret mysteries of the cosmos. Kneeling before one precious thing, however we may imagine it, he honors all precious things in a divinely created world. Has the body of the statue now been dissolved into this wider web of embodied relationality? Second question, or set of questions. In what sense is this poem a prayer? In what sense is it our prayer? Is it possible to read the poem without praying its prayer? Does the poem bind us with its prayer? Does it bind us to the God? Does it bind the God to us? Which God is that? But otherwise, is the poem that might be a prayer inscribed on the statue before which it places us? If so, how and how much does it alter the statue? Is the statue still recognizably a statue of Apollo once we have come to the end of the prayer? Third question or set of questions, and then I'm done. What is that whirlwind doing in the poem? Where does it come from and where does it take us there at the end? Is this not a recognizably biblical whirlwind, swirling around our statue, perhaps threatening to knock it off its base? From the book of Judges, Deborah sings a song of triumph. When you, Lord, marched from the land of Edom, the earth shook, the heavens poured, the clouds poured down water, the mountains quaked before the Lord. In the book of Job, the God speaks with a thundering voice, speaks out of the storm or whirlwind. In Jeremiah, a divine whirlwind swirls down on the heads of the wicked more than once. Is this whirlwind God more Zeus than Apollo, more Hebrew than Greek, more elemental than civilized? What kind of prayer, how many phylacteries does it take to bind such a God? And what kind of prayer does it take to break those bonds? Okay, that's what I got.
Okay, thank you so much, Virginia, for giving us so much interesting observations about this poem. And yeah, I'm sure that we are going to have some discussion after, of course, Giacomo will be presenting his part, and we are looking forward to this.
Thank you so much, Marco, for organizing this occasion to share a wonderful text that I love very dearly. And thank you so much, Virginia, for accepting, this challenge. I understand it's quite challenging to enter a literary system you're not aware of, but I'm glad you took it. You took the time, and I think in my remarks, which will last about 15 to 20 minutes, I will have some answer as to the materiality question, but that will open other questions in between, of course. And really, I look forward to hearing what you think, what you all think, given that this is a text very much shrouded in controversy. So for me, it's very hard to see it outside of those controversies. And there's a way in which, when there's a controversy, you always respond to those, but you miss other things. So you'll tell me if there are things that that struck you as particularly important that are missing in my presentation. The translation that you have is from Isaac Zilberschlag edition of Tschernikowsky, Tschernikowsky, Poet of Revolt. There's a lot of revolt in this poem, of course, too. And in the book, you can find also other poems by him translated into English. And I'm happy to give you more bibliography, primary or secondary, if you're interested in. So I'm going to start, and I will say something about when the poem was published, and then I will move to a more global interpretation of the text, so that we can have then a discussion with these new facts on the table too. So in 1899, writing between Odessa and Heidelberg, between East and West, a young Shaul Tschernikowsky composed a Hebrew poem that would send shockwaves through the emerging landscape of modern Hebrew literature, presenting a scene that was both scandalous and deeply mesmerizing to its contemporary readers. A modern Hebrew poet writing in the language of the Bible, standing before and ultimately kneeling in front of a pagan deity, whom, notice in the first line, he calls forgotten. Which for me is a key adjective to have in mind when we read a whole poem, and you'll see why, at least in my interpretation. So my brief remarks today examine this signature poem, which was to mark the reception of Tschernikowsky's entire body of work as a pagan, not Jewish enough body of work. And this is the first big controversy that in general Tschernikowsky's work is shrouded in. And I treat this poem not just as a simple gesture of aesthetic imitation of European classicism, this has been a main interpretive line, or as an expression of paganism / pantheism, as some critics even today would like to see here, but rather as a critical, sophisticated site of cultural negotiation of the nascent Hebrew culture. At the turn of the 20th century, it was published just before, European national discourses, and this is the bigger context, were heavily dominated by idealized Greek aesthetics. They used the classical form to construct youthful, vigorous national identities. But concurrently, a pervasive fin de siècle anxiety, often weaponized by anti-Semitic medical and political discourses, and interiorized by Jewish European intellectuals, especially Western or Middle European ones, like the popular star of the day, Max Nordau. Everybody read Max Nordau. If you are familiar with Sibilla Le Ramos' book, Una Donna, very famous book in Italian literature, at some point she says, oh, I've read this book and it changed my life. She doesn't say which book it is because it was the book of the day. It was Max Nordau's book on the decadence of Europe. All of these stereotypes cast the Jewish body as an emblem of weakness, old age, and sickliness. So you see what Tschernikowsky has in front of his eyes to some degree. So Tschernikowsky aggressively enters this popular discourse about the Jewish body. He weaponizes instead the classical Greek form, plastically embodied in the statue of Apollo, to perform a radical attempt to emancipate himself, both from traditional Judaism and from its stereotypical image. So I argue that the statue functions in a sort of a paradoxical way, because it serves as an othering mirror for Jewish identity and for the new Jewish body, and as part and parcel of this revolutionary program. In other words, in the mirror, you see something very different, but also something that is meant to remind yourself of who you are and how you're supposed to look, or what you should look like. By turning to the pagan icon, Tschernikowsky rejects traditional religious affiliation. So in this sense, we can answer to some degree Virginia's question, whose prayer is this? Who's praying here? and utilizing the Hebrew language itself as the primary hinge of a new national identity aimed at recreating a trans-historical Jewish identity rooted in a larger, vitalistic Mediterranean culture, which of course includes the Greek. In doing that, Tschernikowsky apparently uses religious discourse and imagery, but also inserts himself in an interreligious perspective that triangulates ancient paganism, and that is apparent, Christianity, which is not so much apparent in the poem, but we'll get to it, and Judaism. Judaism as revised precisely through the encounter between these two different models of paganism and Christianity. So what I mean to say is that Tschernikowsky writes this poem in thinking through an earlier poetical tradition, European tradition, dealing with the contrast between paganism and Christianity. Through this discourse, he aims to bring about his revised version of Jewish identity / Judaism. And I will be more precise as to that in a moment. So to understand how Tschernikowsky achieves this cultural re-engineering, we must first reconstruct the medium of his encounter with antiquity, the materiality of this encounter too. Charles Martindale famously utilized a linear metaphor to describe the chain of classical reception. But in this case, in Tschernikowsky's work, this linear model breaks down because it is rather an intermedial matrix where visual, material, and literary layers from different languages and cultures intersect and comment upon one another. In fact, the Apollo of this poem is a hybrid creation itself, because on one hand, we have a material visual reception. It is Tschernikowsky's personal encounter with the plaster cast of the Apollo Belvedere at the Antiken Museum at the University of Heidelberg. And there has been some bibliography and some studies about this. And of course, this opened the question of how these plaster casts, not being classical antiquity, are reinscribed as classical antiquity themselves. But on the other hand, this marble form is viewed through a modern German Jewish literary reception. And this has not many people have commented on this aspect. Specifically, this is Heinrich Heine's classicizing poetry. So Tschernikowsky, who would later translate Sam Heine into Greek, reads the visual form of Apollo directly through the textual architecture of Heine's 1826 poem, Die Götter Griechenlands, the gods of Greece. In this poem, Heine expresses a deeply ambivalent melancholy for the displaced pagan pantheon, explicitly contrasting their aesthetic grandeur, the marbleness, if you want, with the restrictive ascetic monotheism, Christianity, that has replaced them. Heine writes, and forgive me if I'm going to read it, and I don't have it on the screen. I never loved you, gods, because the Greeks are obnoxious to me. Indeed, I hate even the Romans, but holy compassion and terrifying sympathy course through my heart when I spy you on high, forgotten gods. See where the forgotten is coming from, I think. Dead shadows wandering in the nighttime, drifts of mist dispersed by the wind. And when I consider how cowardly and vapid are the gods who conquered you, of course, the Judeo-Christian gods in a way, the new sad gods who govern us, those cloaked with schadenfreude in the sheepskin of humility, oh, I am seized by a grim resentment, and I would break the new temples and would do battle for you, you old gods. And before your high altars resurrected, I would myself kneel and pray. We are back to the prayer. What Heine frames as a romantic conditional fantasy, I would myself kneel and pray. And of course, his religious standing here is a little bit unclear because, of course, he was born as a Jew. He converted to Christianity later on. He apparently converted back to some form of Judaism, but very idiosyncratic. In one way, this poem is in dialogue with a previous poem, or rather with two previous poems, the two versions of Schiller's The Gods of Greece by the same title. I don't have the time today to go into this matter further, but it's important just for you to know that Schiller was, in fact, debating the place of paganism and Christianity in the public arena. So Heine comes into that and tries to dispute the place of the Christian gods, quote unquote. Tschernikowsky takes this fantasy, this musing of Heine, the I would kneel myself and pray, and transforms it into a radical literal performance of this bowing and praying. He says, I come to you, forgotten gods, God of the ages, God of ancient times and other days, ruling the tempests of vigorous men, the breakers of their strength in youth's plenty. And later on, he actually bows. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that. So textually, the poem can be divided into three thematic sequences. First, the portrait of the god Apollo. As I said, this is all based on mirroring, so the portrait is key. Second, the portrait of the speaking Jew and of the historical diaspora of the Jews. And finally, the transgressive, apparently pagan act of worship before the statue. So let us trace how the poem shifts through these different moments to construct its mirroring. In the first and second sequences, Apollo functions strictly as an opposition mirror. He is what the Jewish people is not. Tschernikowsky portrays Apollo as a handsome, mighty, young conqueror, a fresh youth god who subdues the sun and rules over a generation of gods on earth, drunk with the plenty of life, reflecting the ancient, notice the ancient, that's why it's forgotten, because the modern Greeks, of course, they have the Christian gods, reflecting the ancient Greeks as a vibrant people of heroes. By contrast, about the Jewish people, Tschernikowsky writes, the people is old, and its God has grown old. Here, the poem interiorizes some of the anti-Semitic motifs of its era, as I said, old age, sickliness, depicting the contemporary diaspora as a sick people and a tribe of sufferer living in obscurity and shackled in chains. And to conceptualize this binary, Tschernikowsky, of course, engages explicitly with the oppositional traditional reading of Judaism and Hellenism. As the speaker declares, I am the Jew. Our quarrel is of old, marking the structural gulf and abyss, Peretz and Tehom, that has divided Jew and Greek since antiquity. Once again, an apparent opposition that will soon be revealed not to be accurate. The climax of the poem occurs when Tschernikowsky identifies what these paralyzing historical chains of the Jewish people actually are. And in a brilliant stroke at the end, the final lines reveal that the Jewish God and his people have been bound and entrapped by the straps of their phylacteries, Retzuot shel Tfilin, or actually Retzuos shel Tfilin, because this should be read in an Ashkenazi accent, which is different from the way that we usually pronounce modern Hebrew today. Here, Tschernikowsky directly channels Heine's critique of the new sad deities who are cloaked in the sheepskin of humility. But in this case, the problem is no longer Christianity, as it was for Heine, but rabbinic Judaism, whose practice is exemplified by the literal leather binding of the tefillin, the phylacteries, which is cast as the historical cage that domesticated and withered a once vibrant national deity. I don't need to tell you how dangerous this discourse is, but just take a step back and think about what kind of discourse, anti-Semitic discourse, of course, this was projected on at that time. What we have today is, in a way, a different result of the same point of encounter. Towards the end of the poem, the opposition mirror disappears, becoming a proper mirror, an equation between Greeks and Jews. And in fact, Tschernikowsky dramatically proclaims, I am the first among those who return to you. In a moment when I loathed death froze forever, my vital soul to earth cleaving bursts the chains that bound it. Crucially, this opposition is not rooted in an unchangeable racial, ethnic, or essentialist features. So what is Jewish and what it isn't, which was a common question of the day. It is entirely seen as the product of historical and religious degeneration. And that's why we have these different levels in which we are told that that God has been strapped. It was different in the beginning. Tschernikowsky argues that the Jewish God was not always old and bound. At the beginning, he was the God of the mysterious whirlwind, the god of man who conquered Canaan in a whirlwind. So by looking at the statue of Apollo, the modern Jew at this point does not actually see a stranger, but rather we are told that people mirror their deities. So the ancient Greek mirrored Apollo, and however sadly, we are told that the ancient Jewish god mirrored Apollo himself. That is the whole conceptual architecture of the poem. If we recognize from the Bible the Jewish god as masculine, muscular, again, not easy today to talk about this, but the gender dimension is quite at the center of the poem. If the Jewish god was a masculine, muscular, vitalistic image, then we have to conclude by this principle of reflection, suggests Tschernikowsky, that modern Jews need to return to that God, to that identity. And therefore, the nationalistic return to history is framed here not as an assimilation into European Philhellenism, of which, of course, the poem is witness to. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the plaster cast at all. Or it is not a surrender to paganism, but it is rather a reclamation of a primordial territorial Semitic strength that just matches the power of the classical gods the Heine mourned. It's an equation rather than an identification. In other words, there's basically, if you have in mind the history of the study of religion, you could say that Tschernikowsky uses comparison, not just with the Greek gods, but also with the Mesopotamian epos, to reconstruct the lost image of the initial Jewish God. So to achieve this resurrection, Tschernikowsky commits an act of ultimate poetic rebellion. He kneels, something that is absolutely prohibited in Judaism. I come to you before your statue kneeling, your image, symbol of light's brightness. I kneel, I bow to the good and the sublime. The literal act of bowing before a man-made idol directly contravenes the foundational biblical prohibition against graven images, because it is a radical subversion of the taboo of avodah zarah, the worship of idols, which, notice, in Hebrew is marked as foreign. Zarah means foreign, something that non-Jews do. So it calls into question the demarcation of the Jewish and the non-Jewish. Notice, though, that the speaker is bowing as much to a representation of a Greek god as he is to the metaphorical portrait of Friedrich Nietzsche's Renaissance man, as Guido Harari, in fact, did write. Tschernikowsky, in other words, reads Heine's anti-Christian polemics through the lens of Nietzsche's transvaluation of all values. That attacked by Nietzsche on the Judeo-Christian mentality, which we find in his genealogy of morality and beyond good and evil, just to give you two examples, here is repurposed by Tschernikowsky within an intra-Jewish debate. Tschernikowsky rejects the passive exile slave mentality, the glorified physical meekness and suffering, demanding instead a return to a master mentality defined by pride, force, and an unapologetic embrace of earthly life. A project that in this poem is just intimated, but then will then become a very clear cultural project with Tschernikowsky's translations of Anacreon, which is all about earthly enjoyment. Moreover, through Apollo, Tschernikowsky provides the physical and spiritual model, the body of the new type of Jew, perfectly aligning with the hopes expressed by Max Nordau, he's back, in his famous call for a Muskeljudentum, a muscular Judaism. At that time, not only muscular Judaism became a thing, but also muscular Christianity had become a thing. The Hebrew language becomes so more important in this view than Judaism itself, in that it suggests a national, rather than just religious, belonging, and one that allows the modern Jew to reconnect to a different, not only pre-rabbinic, but even pre-temple form of Judaism. In other words, it's more important Jewishness, or it chooses Jewishness over Judaism, a mentality that Tschernikowsky reconstructs in the mirror with the classical world. It is an aggressive, indeed, creative site of ideological, cultural identity, and physical engineering. By moving through an intricate visual and literary net which spans the body and the success of philhellenism in Europe, as well as debates about Christianity and paganism and Judaism itself, from the Heidelberg Museum cast to the texts of Heine, Nietzsche, and of nationalistic propaganda, both Jewish and not Jewish, Tschernikowsky uses the ultimate classical other of Judaism, we have seen how he calls that into question, to construct and validate a modern Hebrew self. He sculpts, the poet himself sculpts a heroic, healthy body out of the perceived sadness of exile, offering a vitalistic framework designed to enable the Jewish people's return to history. In a way, Tschernikowsky sets the coordinates for the entire century of Hebrew literature that was to follow, where this explosive text finds an ongoing continuation, a complex defensive reaction to, or a fierce ideological opposition, however the poem was understood or mostly misunderstood over time. That's all from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Giacomo. That was, of course, amazing, and it gave us the possibility to enter the universe, the cultural context within which this text has been produced. Virginia, who might be not that familiar with the format of Titubanti Testi, what normally happens at this point is that the first speaker has the chance to say something. Don't feel obliged. It's just if you think you might comment on this briefly. I see that also Richard raised his hand. So maybe, so Virginia, you're first. If you'd like to say something, go ahead.
Sure. I mean, first and most importantly, thank you so much. That was a fascinating kind of historical contextualization. And I've been thinking a little bit as I listen to you about, Marco, you're often pushing back against a kind of historical contextualizing readings of literary texts that in some sense divert our attention from the actual kind of working of the in this case the poem, as literature. And so I'm just sort of throwing that out, thinking about the ways in which the historical contextualization enhances my appreciation of the poem as poem, and the ways in which, in some ways, it also diverts attention and leaves me with some questions. And one of the questions that I'm still left with does have to do with the nature of the body in that last stanza, Giacomo. It seems to me that we've come a long way from that initial evocation of the image of Apollo and the Belvedere, the plaster cast of the Belvedere behind it, it seems to me that there is a sense in which that human imaged body has kind of evaporated on us, right? In the first stanza, we get the very much more descriptive. Sorry, I'm having to kind of pick back up here. Fresh youth, God, magnificent, full, beautiful, and so on. And by the end, as I tried to say in my remarks, it seems to me that we have this kind of, symbolism brought in, that the statue symbolizes certain values, and so I wonder. That seems to me important, and I wonder if you might have more to say about that. It's not simply that image of masculine beauty that Apollo stands in for has been, reclaimed and inscribed in a way, but some things have happened to it along the way.
Yeah, no, can I answer now? Should we?
Of course. No.
Okay.
Yeah,
no, thank you, Virginia. That's really, so this is why I said that you always respond to controversy. So actually the symbolic aspect of Apollo there has been mostly noticed in the bibliography, in the secondary literature. So I actually wanted to reestablish more the materiality of the body, both the statue and the body as it is described. But you are absolutely right. The symbolic nature of that Apollo becomes very central towards the end, because of this perceived opposition between what's Jewish and what is not. So there's a way in which Tschernikowsky, and for this he was very much attacked in his day, and has become basically unreadable today in Hebrew, not only because of linguistic problems, which are there too. Like a high schooler would never be able today to read this text, which was common until the 1990s. It was a school reading. But it is culturally this idea that all of these things that Apollo does are un-Jewish and that need to be instead reintegrated into Jewish culture. It met with huge pushback from people who were very close to Tschernikowsky too, and all the way until today. Basically, try to publish these texts in important periodicals of the day. That was the time of the periodicals as, community making devices. And people would say, I mean, your poems are beautiful Hebrew poems, but they're not Jewish enough. There is something so un-Jewish. And the poem is exactly about that, about putting that demarcation in place and yet transgressing it and saying, oh, actually, that also belongs to us, or it should be ours too. And this demarcation is doing us a disfavor, basically. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to comment on that.
Can I just come back
Sure.
one more time, and
Yeah.
then I promise I'll be silent for a bit. I think I get that, and I thank you for all of the ways that you've brought that through, that that controversial move, and I do sense that the last stanza is the kind of miracle of the poem. That's where everything starts happening, and I think it's very complex, but there, you could say that this is also where a kind of Christian thing comes in, a kind of Byzantine Christian thing, even, because precisely when we get the image itself, right? This is the first time the statue is named as a statue after the title. It's the god before that. Precisely when we get the image, we get the resort to it is a symbol of something else, right? And
You
that
mean it's
is
an
a way.
icon? That's what
That's a way
you're
Christian
getting at.
icons by a kind of, a certain strand of anxious, Christian, anxious and defensive Christian thinking about idols, has traditionally always leaned very heavily into this language of symbolism, or of the icon standing in for something else. And so it's very striking to me that that's the move he makes, whether it's out of a kind of defensiveness. I would want to say no. I would want to say there's something more interesting going on than that. But it is a line of interpretation that's very common in a kind of defensive Christian cultural interpretation, even as it's very clear that what's the relationship to the objects, to the icons, is something very different from that. It's much more intimate. It's much more personal. As my spouse would argue again and again, it's much more animist in relation to the image. So I just want to kind of press for that, that I would love to be able to see something really more interesting happening, other than a kind of defensive move that as soon as we have the icon, the statue itself present, it has to become a symbol of something else.
No, thank you so much. I will give you just 3 facts, as brief as possible. You are right. This kind of Byzantine, even Orthodox, modern Orthodox mood, I think, is pretty much there. It's not by chance that the poem was written between Odessa and Western Germany. So I think that's a fact. And then thank you for pushing the fact that there's a statue, and then there's a body, and then there's a statue again, and then there's a symbol. All of that is present. One of the major, so I mentioned the biblical prohibition of worshiping statues, but actually in the Talmud, one of the big question is, can you go to a bathhouse where there's a statue of a deity? Because you might be praying even unwillingly. What is, again, the demarcation? How can you tell that you're not praying even by, even by mistake to a statue of a god? And of course, that is also present in the way many Orthodox Jews deal today with visiting churches. They just don't, because that might lead to an involuntary act of worship. Finally, maybe most important, Tschernikowsky's wife was Russian Orthodox, and towards the end of his life, he lived next door to a very famous Orthodox monastery. This was decades after he wrote this poem, because his wife had to take part in all the celebrations of the monastery. So it definitely does indicate a specific sensibility that Tschernikowsky had. So thank you so much for bringing it up. It's really important, and I think it's very. So I'm thinking about writing a note about this poem, a note or a longer interpretation, and there's so much. Thank you for bringing it up. And I think, Richard, it's time for you to speak.
Yeah, now we have, indeed. Thank you so much, Giacomo. Thank you, Virginia. We might have time to discuss. Also, Glenn is invited to say something if he'd like to. But I have two questions now, Richard and then Marco. Please go ahead, Richard.
Just three quick comments. Giacomo, you and I could talk about this poem, I think, for hours. Number one, I think there could be arguably a dialectic of bitul here, of nullification. You mentioned Avodah Zarah, the tractate of the Mishnah. A Jew can only make use of a statue, a pagan statue, if it has been decommissioned by a non-Jew. And when you think about the place of secular culture and secular education in the 19th century in a gymnasium system, right? All of this sort of pagan Greek stuff is being repurposed to center secular culture because it is no longer religious. It has become art, right? Ever since Winkelmann, right? Because it exists in the Christian, space. So in a sense, it is open to a Jew to make use of the decommissioned pagan path, right? Even though, of course, biblically, there's this tremendous tension between them, simply because the pagans don't exist. In other words, the cultures have rejected these statues. They are therefore available in a way. So it's kind of funny. This dialectic of bitul, I would say, that you could argue, because what he's also doing, it's a nullification not only of the paganism, right, but a nullification in the way of a particular, traditional view of Judaism that he's moving away from. So I think that maybe if you think about, Avodah Zarah and this idea of bitul, maybe there's something to work with there, even though it's clearly provocative, clearly the kind of, pagan style, Volksgeisty thing that some, cultural Zionists, probably a Chad Hacham, I would assume, would have hated, just like they did not like the worship of the Maccabees and the Maccabee clubs among the Zionists. They thought this was a terrible idea, right? So two other things quickly. One, I think going back to Schiller's Gods of Greece, this is very important because Schiller is looking, if you read that poem in relation to naive and sentimental poetry, Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Man, it's very much about modern alienation from nature, right? And that really it's not just Christianity. It is the modern secular view of science that creates the alienation from nature. He talks about, the way now we look at the moon and it's just this sort of mechanical object, in Newtonian universe. So again, I think Heine and Schiller are very much present here in an interesting way, because when he gets back to talking about the statue as a symbol of life's brightness, this sounds a lot like, Schiller's problem of the naive and sentimental vis-a-vis Nietzsche. Lastly, and then I'll be quiet, Tschernikowsky was a doctor, right? And there's a really important discourse on the body between art and medicine in the 19th century. And I am thinking a lot about this actually, because here's an announcement. In 2027, we're doing another exhibition at the Freud Museum London. This is on Freud and visual culture. So I'm thinking a lot about lithography, photography, and the relationship between art and medicine. And there's a lot about this where people who are physicians, like Paul Richet at the Salpêtrière, who was Charcot's sort of main assistant, also get very involved with the Olympian movement in the early 20th century, where the timing is very important, and the eugenics movement as well, in terms of the racial rebirth, the redisciplining of the body. I think this does tie in with certain types of Zionism as well, because of the concern for the industrial decline of the body. And of course, in the medical discourse among Jews, there's this long issue about neurosis as being endemic to Jewish populations because of the centuries of repression. So, I think maybe one thing for you to look at too is that thread of his medical background as a way back to aesthetics, although for us that might sound surprising. It actually isn't. It was fundamental to medical education and the discourse of anatomy. Artistic anatomy and medical anatomy were completely linked. And, Paul Richet ended up as a professor of artistic anatomy, even though he was a doctor, famous for his studies of historian, at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, So there are these really important links there discursively to trace. But thank you again. You and I could talk later, I'm sure, for hours, but thank you.
Before, maybe because of the time, we take also the second question, and then maybe we can discuss. I don't know whether you have all the questions, guys. Everybody's welcome, but I see Marco now, Marco Vespa.
Yes, thank you very much. I will be very brief. Thanks, Virginia, and thanks, Giacomo. I just wanted to know from Giacomo if he can tell us something more about this passage of the text in the second stanza, in the second chunk, when it says, "The light of God is mine." Because when I was reading the poem, I had in mind a kind of, leading motif or isotopy, whatever, of light. So Apollo, of course, and then it is, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
I can.
And then it talks about the secret stores of light and then brilliant at the end. And I wanted to know if, according to you or according to some critics, there is, since you've talked about this idea of muscular Jewishness or muscular identity, whatever, if you think that behind this phrase or behind this, the light of God is mine, there could be a symbolic appropriation, if you want, of the Hanukkah ritual. So this revolt of Maccabean against, in this case, against Greeks, against Seleucid people. And of course, there the importance of the light, or this oil that is important to light the menorah, and this oil then, like a miracle, it lasts a lot of time. So if someone had some idea about that, and what do you think about this kind of metaphorical use of light and this possible reference to the Hanukkah stories? Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, of course. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, Richard, Marco, thank you so much. Of course, Richard, as you said, we will talk about this more. But yes, as to the medical background, definitely. I mean, Tschernikowsky was a doctor, and that's why he was so actually into Greek and Latin culture, because that was needed just even to enter, just even to enroll into medicine. But that's also why I was mentioning Max Nordau, who was also a doctor by background, and then became a sort of a popularizer of these great visions about Europe. And of course, what you said about also eugenetics is deeply connected at that time with the idea of the nation, and how should a nation be, and what's the body of the nation. And of course, each nation has its own self-projected image. And this is the moment when the Jewish nation starts building even this awareness of nation, building, meaning that this national belonging was not something available before. So once Zionism and other movements, which we still call Zionism today, even though they did not use this term, started developing their political and cultural views, of course, the body was at the center of these anxieties. So congratulations on the Freud Museum exhibition. I hope I'm going to see it. But yes, as to this, that's what I had to say. As to Schiller, of course, you're right. I didn't have the time to enter that text too much tonight. But yes, there is no doubt, and this is also to some degree typical of Tschernikowsky, that he is writing a European text in Hebrew. European, especially German maybe, but not only. That's why we have these different sensibilities in it, from Eastern European to more Western European, so German sensibilities. And as to the commission statue, I don't know how far I'm going to be ready to go with it, because you remember there are other cases too, in which the statue is in use, but it's not in use as a worship statue. So it's not exactly decommissioned. But sorry for the example, but the Mishnah gives this example. If you see pagans taking a lick at the foot of the statue, then it's not for worship, so it's okay. So there is some space there, some leeway. Certainly the idea of forgotten as decommissioned is important, and that's key to the text, in that Tschernikowsky is taking this bigger context and bigger discourse, which is not only Jewish, and making it Jewish, actually, which was not at all Jewish, and he makes it Jewish. Yes, but thank you. We have to think about this more. And Marco, as to, it's very interesting you brought up Hanukkah. I didn't think about that. So my answer is sort of temporary. Hanukkah did go through a major change, cultural change, at the end, in the second half of the 19th century. You mentioned that the oil miracle and the Maccabees, these are sort of two. There's a tension between those two poles of the Hanukkah celebration. The Maccabees become central to the Hanukkah celebration in the 19th century, especially in the second half, because of the national meaning that it has. So I cannot give you a definitive answer. I have to think about it more in depth. I tend to think that in general here the reference to the light comes rather on the wing of generic, these kind of marbleness of ancient of classical antiquity, and the whiteness, the candid whiteness that they imagined the statues to have been. But I haven't explored that other side. So thanks to you, I'll try and do it. Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Do we have another question or remark? I don't know whether Virginia would like to say something. We can't hear you. I don't know.
No, thanks. I'm
okay.
good.
Okay. Well, so yeah, we are at the end of our. No, John. Okay, great. John, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Virginia and Giacomo. This is a fascinating poem. I'd never heard of this poet nor this poem before. And I'd like to just go back briefly to the idea of the materiality and also the Apollo Belvedere, thinking of this as a meditation on a particular statue. John Hollander has this wonderful book called A Gazer's Spirit, Poems Speaking to Silent Works of Art. And that's what this poem is, speaking to a silent work of art. And in doing so, I think in many of the examples that Hollander discusses, the same sort of things are going on here. Obviously, a reworking, an overwriting, to use Virginia's word, from her example of Dionysus, and a distortion too. And if just two small points about that. There's very little here about the visual of the god. I mean, if we think about that statue or a statue of Apollo generically, he's young and he's beautiful. That's basically it. They're alluding to other aspects of the god, the song, the laurel, etc. But in terms of the visualization, and this sort of emptying of the context of the god, Belvedere is an archer god, that element. Here he's just the beautiful young god. That emptying of his nature, on the one hand, allows for the pliability of the dynamic that Giacomo, you so unpacked in the poem. But at the same time, from the classical point of view, there's a dramatic expansion mythologically. He's not in classical times the god of tempests, of waves. That's Neptune. He's not affiliated with the giants, other than to fight against the giants in the Gigantomachy, along with the other Olympian gods. And so he's mythologically, I see here that he's made into a greater god, a sort of cosmic classical god, which will heighten the opposition between a god and then the god, God with a small g, God with a capital G. Anyway, those are just a few thoughts. Thank you both for this wonderful meditation on this poem.
Thank you so much.
Can I just say something in relation to what John just said?
Yes, please go ahead. But Richard, keep in mind,
this goes
back
back to Virginia's point as well. I think it's really crucial that we see that Apollo is a symbol of life's brightness. And when he says, I kneel, I bow, he says to the good and to the sublime, which of course, I don't know the Hebrew word he's using here, but the sublime brings in a whole different sort of discourse, right? Ever since Kant and Burke, okay? Yeah. And then he talks about to all the splendid things of creation. So by defining nature as creation, we go back to a safer space. The heavens proclaim, the glory of God, that psalmist kind of view of creation, right? So that's why I'm saying it's very dialectical what's happening here, right? And I think Virginia's right. He becomes an icon, a symbol of life's brightness, but then life is expanded, as John was saying. We're getting way beyond any Apollo, specifically pagan Apollo cult, into something way broader. And once we enter creation, we're going back to the Jewish point of view, right?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for this, both of you. Thank you. Yes, John, this is right. I mean, Apollo is in a way a pantheon unto himself. He's not just the Apollo that we know from mythology, going back to the usual prerogatives and attributes that he has. But he really represents that kind of Greek world and that kind of Greek religion in general. I think there's some Nietzsche here too, of course, but you see also this is a very Dionysiac Apollo, right? So it's very present there, this idea. So in other words, the opposition that is at the center of the poem sort of allows for poetical licenses in other areas, I think. Does it make sense? In a way, also, I think that what he's doing is very much resonates with, again, Heine's poems. Whenever Heine depicts the Greek gods, not just in the poem that I read, but also in other ones, he's not really looking, he's not there with a mythology book. He's there with this kind of expansive view of what classical antiquity was meant to be. Sometimes even ironic, there's a passage, one of his prose texts, I'm sure, Richard, you think about this. He meets Venus, and of course, it's the Venus of Milo, and she says to him, "Can't you see I cannot help you? I don't have arms." It's so there is some kind of Heine move here. Yes, I forgot what I also wanted to say, but yes, with Richard we'll continue the conversation, and I'll message some of you, and we'll continue some part of this conversation. I actually didn't know Hollander's book, so I'm gonna look it up. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much. This was a very rich discussion. I'm so glad and grateful, of course. Vered just joined, but we are at the end. Oh, maybe she didn't. Hello, Vered. Sorry, we are at the end. We are closing just now. Yeah.
Is she in?
And I do see her. Hello, Vered. No, she disappeared again. Well.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. In any case, thank you so much again. And there might be another binomio, which is not on the program. I will tell you as soon as I know whether it is confirmed or not. In any case, thank you so much. Enjoy your summer if we didn't see each other before, and stay in touch for the next cycle. That will be we will be beginning again in October. So if you have something to propose, everybody is welcome. You know, the rule is absolutely free, and everybody can propose a text. Okay, so thank you so much again, and see you soon.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Grazie Marco, grazie.
Bye bye. Thank you.
Dank u
Bye.
wel.